by that link. And the cuts that are covered by the link are the following. So look at the path that goes between the endpoints of the link, like this path. So there's a unique path in the tree between the endpoints. And actually that link will cover precisely the 3 cuts corresponding to the 3 edges on the path. Let me just give you once more the example. So that edge here corresponds to that cut, right? If I remove the edge, so this is one of the 2 components. This edge here corresponds to that cut over here, and the last one here will correspond to this cut. And indeed, the link L will cross all of those, and precisely those, and none of the other ones. This means that actually, when you talk about tree augmentation, we can really think of covering the tree itself, because this really corresponds to covering the cuts. So let me just rephrase this here. So the tree augmentation problem is really the same as finding a subset of the links of minimum cost or minimum weight, such that if you look at the union of all those paths, that they cover the whole spanning tree. So it's just another way to look at it, but it's the precise same problem, of course, as before. Just things are a bit easier to visualize that way. What else? So how else can you think about tree augmentation problem? It's really the problem that corresponds to augmenting the connectivity of a connected graph from 1 to 2. Because if you have a general connected or one connected graph like this one here, so what you can do is, and if you have an augmentation problem on that one, you can first contract all of the 2 edge connected components. So there's one over here. You can contract. Let's make sure I get them correctly. There's a big one here, it seems. This is a 2 edge connected component. There's one over here, and I see 2 more. So those parts are already 2 edge connected, so you can contract them, and what is left is a spanning tree. And therefore, if you have an augmentation problem on such a graph, it really just reduces to an augmentation problem on a spanning tree. So you can therefore think of tree augmentation as augmenting the connectivity from 1 to 2. So you can also say that it's a k equals 1 case. There's maybe one more thing I would like to highlight, namely that this may have looked a bit maybe peculiar, this first example I gave you. Let me just go back to the first one, in the sense that, just this one here, in the sense that if you look at these minimum cuts, actually those cuts, they form what is called a laminar family. So you see these min cuts here, they have the property that any 2 green cuts you see here are either disjoint or one is contained in the other one. It's called a laminar family. It turns out it's not a coincidence, because here, whenever a graph has an odd edge connectivity, here like k equals 3, then the min cuts will form a laminar family. That's not true for even edge connectivity. It's not so hard to prove. I will skip it here, but it's a nice exercise. I'm also happy to give more details if you would like me to, but just good to know, because this actually shows that the tree augmentation problem is even more general, because here what we really have to do in that example is we have to cover a family of cuts that's a laminar family, but it's another way to think about the tree augmentation problem. It's about covering cuts that are a laminar family, because trees do represent laminar families. So actually you can reduce also this problem here to tree augmentation problem. And it turns out, therefore, you can reduce any augmentation problem from an odd connectivity to the next even one. You can reduce it to a tree augmentation problem, but not from even to the next odd one. That's a more general problem. So that's good to know. Just to give you a bit of context, but I would like to focus on the tree augmentation problem. So let me go back to this example and just talk about what was known before. As I mentioned, so those problems, maybe I should first say up front that those problems are all APX hard, so it's hard to approximate them better than a certain constant factor. So kind of the constant factors are the gold standard here. You want to get the lowest constant factor possible. And so it also turns out that there's something in common with many network design problems. Namely, it's often quite easy to get a 2 approximation and much harder to go below a factor of 2. So what you see here is the evolution of those approximation factors. So for the weighted tree augmentation problem, actually a factor of 2 was the best known until last year. I will get back to that point in a short moment. And people also heavily studied the unweighted version, or also called the unit weight version, so the version where all the weights are equal to 1, where Nagamachi found the very first procedure beats the factor of 2, and just then later improved through a sequence of nice results that also were influential in stuff that came later partially. So I actually also show here results that did not strictly improve the approximation factor time they got published, but they showed some new ideas that were quite influential later on. So maybe what I also want to say is that when we talk about approximation algorithms here, so I'm really actually not that interested in the factors themselves. I'm mostly interested in the techniques. So I think those augmentation problems, also like the weighted tree augmentation problem, is just a great benchmark to understand what is a good technique, to understand when a certain technique can be successful. And also if you're able to improve such factors here for those problems, typically you found some technique that hopefully may be of broader interest, but of course only time will tell. So the factors are not so important, it's more a benchmark. And maybe just about, I said it's easy to get to approximation. So it turns out for this, you can use procedures like primal dual algorithms, you can use so-called iterative relaxation procedures, or even quite simple combinatorial algorithms giving you a to approximation. And I will show you one of them later on. So that's it's actually quite easy to find different ways to get it to approximation. So what I want to talk about today are techniques that can help to improve on this factor of 2 for the weighted tree augmentation problem. But as I mentioned, I really want to talk about the techniques in the background, not about the factors. But those techniques have been, to some extent, have been introduced already previously, have been used in different forms previously, namely the relative greedy procedure. And we also use the so-called non-oblivious local search procedure. I would like to talk a bit more about those techniques, how they relate, and also show a new connection between them. So now I'm actually it's a good moment to talk a bit about the menu or the outline for the rest of this talk. So I want to give you first a primer to the relative greedy algorithm. And that's one procedure we will use to find first improvements. It's a procedure that maybe in short does the following. It actually starts with a weak approximation, in our case with a 2 approximation, and then tries to successively improve that solution by exchanging parts of it with cheaper parts. That's an easy way to explain it, but of course to realize it's a different story. So it turns out that those relative greedy procedures, they have kind of an obvious flaw, namely they will only improve on with respect to the original solution. So that the reason why we're able to improve on the original 2 approximation with relative greedy procedures is because the original solution, the weak one, is very structured. And that structure will be exploited to then find improvements. But the more you start exchanging the solution, the less of that structure is left, and the harder it gets to keep improving it. And that's one point I want to discuss later on. I will show you a new link to local search procedures that help to actually partially at least fix that issue. And in between, I just missed the point in between. Actually, after giving a primer to relative greedy, I would also like to show you first how it improves on a factor 2 approximation for WTAP, for weighted tree augmentation, before then moving on to the local search procedures. So far, so good. So let's get started on the relative greedy algorithm. And let me explain it in the context where it was introduced. It's actually Steiner tree, introduced by Tsolekowski. So maybe just very quick, what is Steiner tree? So in Steiner tree, you're given an undirected graph. So let me just draw a graph here and add a few more edges. And there's another point here. So think of gray and blue together as just one undirected graph with weights on the edges. And some of the vertices are special, so sort of square ones, and they are called terminals. The task in Steiner tree is to find a subgraph that's as cheap as possible and connects all of the terminals, but does not need to connect the other vertices. So what you can assume in a Steiner tree setting is you can assume that actually your graph is complete. Because if any edge is missing, let's say this edge here, for example, is missing, you can simply check what's the shortest path between U and V, what's the cheapest way to connect U and V, and then add an edge with weight being equal to the distance between U and V. And then you're sure it did not really make anything simpler than it used to be, because it would just replace, whenever you use that new artificial edge, you can just replace it by the shortest path you compute it up from. So think of it as being a complete graph, but I keep it that way just to the picture is a bit nicer. So what exactly did Tsolekowski do? And that's another network design problem that is actually where it's also very easy to get a 2 approximation. It turns out if you just want to get a 2 approximation, what you can do is you can just compute a minimum spanning tree on the terminals only. So this is what I show here in blue. Think of this as a minimum spanning tree if you only use edges that connect terminals to each other, but nothing that connects a terminal to a non-terminal. So restrict yourself. So it turns out this is a 2 approximation. Also, this can be proven relatively quickly, but let me skip this here. And so what then now happens is, Tsiolkovsky suggested that let's do the following. Let's try to find a subset of the edges that he calls a component. So for example, let me pick one. It could be this one here. So of course I didn't indicate the weight, so we don't quite know from the example that this is such a good component, but let me just give you the example. So we could pick the green edges, and we would like to add a subset of the edges, so let's say the green edges here to our solution. But if we do that, then we can remove some of the blue edges that we had of our minimum spanning tree between the terminals. So for example, you can remove this one here, we could remove that one here, and we can remove one of these two. That's probably we're going to remove the one that's heavier. So that's what Tsiolkovsky does. He says maybe it's the heavier one, the one with the larger weight. Let's remove that one. And now if you look at green, together with the blue that I did not cross out, that's again a Steiner tree. Of course, we have to analyze what exactly can you remove and how much are you going to win. And what Tsiolkovsky showed is that actually there exists, if the original solution, the blue one, this what people call the terminal spanning tree, if that one is a factor of 2 higher than optimal solution, then you can actually find, and not just a factor of 2 can even be just higher in terms of weight than optimal solution. Let's say a factor of 2 higher, just to be on have an easy ratio to think about. Then you can find a small component, so actually a constant number of green edges, such that if you can add them and remove things from blue, such that what you win, so what you remove has a significantly higher cost than what you add. It's actually almost essentially by a factor of 2. And so this is so the way the analysis, I'm not going to replicate the analysis, but essentially there are 2 important ingredients to make such relative greedy procedures work. One of them is you have to make sure that there actually exists a good component that will lead to an improvement if you add it, right? And the second one is you have to make sure you can find it, right? So what Tsiolkovsky did here is, because he only looks at constant size components, and that was typically the case, is what people did in the relative greedy procedures typically up to now. And then one of the problems is gone. You can just look at all possible components you could potentially add, and if one of them is good, you will find it, right? And then to prove that there is a good one can show that actually there's an almost optimal solution consisting of a lot of such small components that just connect a small number of terminals. And so one can use that then to show that one of them will be good and you will find it. So it's a bit more involved technically, but that's really the idea behind it. Let me just immediately talk about one of the issues of relative greedy. One of the issues is that, so the analysis really just works against a terminal spanning tree. It's a very structured spanning tree. It's much easier to understand what you can remove from a terminal spanning tree when you add stuff. So, but as soon as you replace some of the blue edges, like I did here, by a new component, it turns out that the new solution you have, so in my case, green, together with the blue that did not get crossed out, so that one is not a terminal spanning tree anymore. Therefore, we lose that super rich structure we had at the beginning, which was needed to do the whole analysis. That's why what those procedures typically do, also what Tsiolkovsky did is, he says, okay, I really only can analyze a terminal spanning tree the way I would like to. So that actually, after having such a component, I will contract it. I will contract the green component. So all those terminals will become one new big terminal. And then what we are left with is, again, blue edges, which are a terminal spanning tree, and we keep going. That's the idea. One issue with that idea is that in the background in analysis, we always think about, oh, we have a near optimal solution, and we can actually, and that one consists of many small components. And if you add those components, if you add all of those components, you could win all of the blue stuff. But now when you contract the green part, you have less and less of the blue stuff left. So you kind of start comparing against the lower and lower fraction of the cost of your current solution. I'll get back to that issue, but I think it's good to mention it early on. And so we just repeat that step. That's the relative greedy procedure. So again, main steps, start with a highly structured solution, and then exploit that structure, but with a weak approximation factor, exploit the structure to improve small parts. So then we now move back to the weighted tree augmentation problem. And let me just give you, as I promised before, a very simple 2 approximation algorithm that also then will help us to start and will show us with what 2 approximation we will start our relative greedy procedure. So here's a general instance, some instance of tree augmentation. So what we do is the following. Let's just first pick an arbitrary vertex that I call the root. Let's pick the top one here, but it really doesn't matter. In the next step, before we start solving anything on that instance, let's do the following operation. Let's, for each link that we have here, like let's look at the brown one, for example, we replace it by two copies, by two what people call shadows, but let me be more explicit about it. So say it's the link L. Let's look at its path, PL, so the path between the endpoints of that link. So it goes between U and B. And we check what is the vertex closest to the root on that path. So that's the vertex over here. So one could think of that as the least common ancestor of U and B if you want. And what we do, and this has been done already many times in the context of tree augmentation, one can replace that brown link, which gets replaced by two copies, one from one endpoint to the least common ancestor, and the other one from the other endpoint over there. And we do this for every single link. So it turns out for the gray one, the least common ancestor, no splitting was necessary because the least common ancestor of the two endpoints is already the top vertex, and therefore there was not, splitting would lead to the same link and an empty link. So here nothing changed. But for the other links, we always replaced one link by two links. And so we create a new instance. So we start with that instance. Now we have a new instance, and also have to tell you what the weights are here. So we just assign to the brown links here, to each of the two brown links, the same weight as the brown link has over here. So the weight of this brown link here is W of L, and the same for that one here is also W of L. So the new instance, what we did is actually, we now have weaker links, so links that it's also good to know that those links, maybe I should have been more explicit about that. Let's look at one of those brown links. Let's say the longer one here. If you look at its path is a subpath of the path PL over here. So this is really just a weaker link. That's why people like to talk about shadows when they talk about such short link procedures, because the path is like a shadow of the other one. It only covers a smaller part of the original link. So therefore, it's clear that that instance here has no better solutions than what we had before. And also any solution you find in here, you can easily transform into one of the same cost over here. Just whenever you pick at least one brown link, just pick the original brown link and you'll be fine. So why did we do that step? We did that step because now all the links have a very special structure that is so-called uplinks. An uplink means that if you look at the two endpoints, let's again take the long brown one, then one of the endpoints lies between the other one and the root. So another way to think about it is each link kind of starts somewhere and then goes towards the root and then stops at some point. But it never goes towards the root and then bends down again. So if you look at the path, it never bends down again. It just goes towards the root and stops. That's why people like to call these links uplinks, right? They go up. So why is that useful? It turns out if you have uplinks only in your instance, then you can actually even solve the instance efficiently. So the problem moves from APX hard to a problem in P. And there are different ways to do so. So one can show that the natural LP, the natural covering LP, is actually totally in the modeler, has a totally modeler constraint matrix and is naturally integral. So you could just solve the LP, get a vertex solution, and you will have a 2 approximation. But what you also can do is you could also just build a solution bottom up through a dynamic program. You have to think a bit about it, but life gets much easier by the fact that the links don't bend down again, but they only go up towards the root. So I claim that if you do that, so if you start an instance, you split the links, you find the best doubling solution, you will actually have a 2 approximation. And the reason is the following: just look at an optimal solution. If I look at an optimal solution, just split each link of the optimal solution into 2 parts, just the way I did it here from the left to the middle picture, I will get another solution, an uplink-only solution of cost at most twice expensive than the original one, because it just doubled the links. Right? But I can find that solution in my instance over here, and because I find the best one, I will be no worse than a factor of 2 of it. So it is a 2 approximation to this solution here will be a 2 approximate solution. That's not quite the one we use as a starting one for our degree procedure. We do a little pruning step, a little additional pruning step that makes the solution even more structured. Namely, here on the left-hand side, you see again the solution I had beforehand, the uplink solution. And look at the 2 green links. So it turns out those 2 green links that we have here, there's one edge that they commonly cover. Is that from the root down here is covered by both of them. So it turns out that we can shorten one of those links and still have a solution. So here I shortened this link here, I shorten it to that one. Again, shortening means I just move one of the endpoints on somewhere onto the paths between the two endpoints. And then you get another link that only covers a subpath of the original path. So a weaker link. So what I did here, and this solution it turns out to be fully shortened. So there's no link you can shorten anymore without not having a solution anymore. And so I would just call this a shadow minimal or a minimal solution. And they have the property that every edge in our graph here, in our spanning tree, is covered by precisely one link. It's kind of nice. So now this is a super highly structured two approximation. And remember, that's kind of the idea of relative greedy. I want to start with something extremely structured with a weak approximation factor, but the structure should help me later on to improve the solution. And so this is the structure we have now. So structure is oblinks only, and every edge is covered by precisely one link. And another way to phrase it is that the paths PU for the links we have here, they're all disjoint. They don't overlap. So let's just talk about the high-level relative greedy procedure for WCAP I would like to implement here, but I will provide details later on. So we'll skip some parts in terms of especially how I will choose components, but just to have the idea of what are the main steps. So here we have again our shortened oblink solution, our minimal oblink solution. And so what we're going to do is at the beginning is to set U. I will just call this U. And now we'll do just like Tchaikovsky did in the signer tree setting. We will try to find a subset of links that we can add to our solution. And then we want to remove some parts of U, and in a way that we remove something that's heavier than what we add. That's what we would like to do. So in short, we will find some components, let's say those green links here. Because I have the color coding is already here, but I'm just repeat it on that side. It's called component C. Once we add C, we will check what that component actually covers. So we have two links here, let's say L1 and L2. So L1 covers this part, and L2 covers that part. So again, this is as before PL2, and this one is PL1. So you see that I don't need this blue link anymore, and I don't need that blue link anymore, because what they cover is not fully covered by our new component. So the procedure will select a component. Again, I have to be more specific later on how we do so. We'll select some component, and then it will remove whatever is fully covered by that component. And what is fully covered by that component, I will call this a drop. Just drop U of C. Drop U of C means whatever you can drop from U if you add the component C, the link C. Just the way I explained it before. In other words, everything that all the links in U whose path is fully contained, is fully covered by the path of the component we just added. And we keep repeating those steps as long as we're able to decrease the weight of our solution. So as before with Steiner tree, we have at the beginning just the set U, just the oblinks. We will add a component, drop some of the oblinks. So what we add will enter into this set F. Then U gets smaller, F gets bigger, until we're not able to improve anymore. And at that moment, we return. So the big question now is, and as I said, I want to talk about relative greedy also more generally here. So let's again just talk about the big, maybe the big questions to address if you want to make an approach like that work is, of course, how do you actually choose those components, right? On the one hand, you want to make sure that, so what we're going to do is we actually going to choose components that will minimize what you pay versus what you get. So what you pay W of C is how much the component costs, and W of the drop is how much weight you gain by deleting links that used to be there from the beginning, right? And so we say we minimize that ratio is the same as, of course, maximizing the reciprocal ratio. So you can think of it as maximizing the bang for the buck, right? That's really what it does. And we would like to do so, but now the problem is, of course, that, I mean, ideally, in a perfect world, I would love to minimize that expression over all possible links at C. But that's, of course, there's no way we will be able to do that, because then I could find optimal solutions. Because I would just, as long as I don't have an optimal solution, I could always replace my whole solution by a whole optimal solution, right? And just delete the whole solution I have now. So this means that or at least I will get close to finding optimal solutions. A bit different because I only replace uplinks. But this is too hard. Minimizing that ratio over all possible link sets is a hard problem. So we just know there's little hope we'll be able to do that. So we want to. That's why we normally restrict ourselves to a smaller class of components, a smaller class of link sets that we actually consider as being link sets of components we will add. It's the same what Zenklusen did, and also prior approaches using relative greedy did. They simply considered constant size link sets. And therefore, that problem was gone. They just considered all options and took the best one. The issue here, as we will see later, is that constant size link sets do not work out for WTAP. And I think that's also one of the messages I would like to convey here. Relative greedy is a super nice, I think, idea by Zenklusen, and it maybe didn't get as much fame partially because it's hard to find. It's hard to find good classes of which you can optimize, but maybe we should sometimes also try to look beyond the constant size sets, constant size links, or constant size solution sets or component sets to find replacements. So what exactly do we now want from that class of components to make improvements? We really want two things. So on the one hand, as I just said, we want to be able to minimize that ratio or maximize this bang for the buck among all components in that class of components we're considering. But on the other hand, we also have to make, so of course, if you just want to do that, it would be easy. We just choose a small component class, and in there it will be easy to minimize. So we have to make sure it's also large enough, the component class, and I come to point B, that as long as we have a bad solution, so one where the uplinks are very expensive compared to opt, that there actually is a good component in the class that allows for improving. So there is, as long as, and more precisely, as long as the weight of our uplinks is clearly larger than opt. And when I say clearly larger, what it really means just a 1 plus epsilon factor larger is enough, actually. But I just write that sign just to keep things simple. So as long as that holds, there should exist one component in our class for which that ratio is below 1. Below 1 means we make progress, we pay less for what we add compared to what we can remove. So it's kind of the two main properties you want to have from your component class, A and B. So let's just get back to that issue about why not do what people essentially did so far. Why not just say, okay, let's just pick the constant size link sets and see what happens. Let me give you an example here. So you see the 4 types of links, and the color coding shows what weights they have. Think of M as a big constant, but we don't need to go to the precise weights. Let me just explain on the picture. It's not so hard to see in the picture. So it turns out for that example here, the optimal solution consists of green and blue. And let's just talk about green. Let me just add that. So green is the link L. And you see its path covers all of that. Then together with blue, that will actually cover all of the edges of the tree. That's good. However, we may start with a solution, with an uplink solution consisting of orange and brown. So first, that one is actually an uplink solution. It's also, by the way, a minimal or shadow minimal uplink solution. So everything is covered precisely once, so that it could be a storing solution for our relative greedy procedure. So it's not a completely contrived example. And now comes the issue. So how can you replace brown-orange links against green and blue ones? So what you can do is, so the green one by itself will not allow you to replace any of the other links, because the orange ones do not cover anything. The green covers, and the brown ones always cover at least something else as well. So the green by itself will not help. And you could add blue ones. When you add a blue one, for every blue one you add, you can remove right away the orange one that is incident with the blue one, but they have the same weight. So just that exchange that will not improve the weight. Of course, if you don't like ties, I can change the weights a bit to make sure it's actually inverse to do that step. So, however, what is really improving things is you need to add green, which is actually an extremely good link. It's an expensive link, but a very good link. But it's only very good if you can add a lot of blue. Because if you can add a lot of blue together with green, you can also remove a lot of the brown ones, the brown links. However, you don't see that if you only add a constant number of links. If I have many of those gadgets, many of those vertices in my graph, if I just extend that example to left and right, then to be able to remove a lot of the brown ones, and I need to remove a constant fraction of those, a linear number, to actually make any profit, I would need to add a linear number of blue links together with the green one. That's a super constant set. So long story short, constant size link sets is not going to work out here. And that's one example why this is the case. So we need a different link class. And so what we suggest is you can use so-called constant, what we call constant thin components. And again, this is really designed with these properties A and B in mind that a component class should have. And so let me first just talk about what is a constantly thin or O1 thin component. Or more precisely, what is a K thin component? So k thin for just any number k. So a subset of links is k thin if every vertex lies on at most no more than k many paths of your component. Let me just show you the example. So I claim that these three links are too thin. The reason is it's just, you can number them, it's L1, L2, L3, and let's look at their corresponding paths. So one is this one here, that's PL1. One is the L2 that goes from here. Let's make sure it goes down the right way. So go up here and down here. That would be PL2. And the last one is L3 that goes up to here and down here. That's PL3. And you see that every vertex lies on at most two of those three paths. And that's why this component, we call it too thin. So somehow you can have a lot of links in your component, that's fine, but you have to make sure that they don't, there's not vertices where a lot of them go through a vertex. Let me just, before I keep going on this slide, maybe let me just go back to the previous slide, just to see whether this actually helps for that instance here. So here, if we take green and blue together, that is actually too thin, right? Because blue will have those paths here go up to V1 and then back again to a leaf, and V2 the same. So they will, and the green will just go, as shown here, green goes just horizontally. So every vertex, V1, V2, V3, and so on, is in two paths, and all the other vertices are only in one path. So that is a too thin component. So that one would be in our class. So we could find that component and improve the whole solution. Yeah. Let's get back to this slide on thin components. So now we have to go back to the A and B property you want to have about such component classes. Property A, we said we have to be able to minimize that ratio over all links that's in that component class, and actually be able to do so through a dynamic program. Also, a few words about it on, I think, the next slide. And the other one is we have to make sure that if the uplinks are much more expensive than not, then there exists a component that is improving. And this will show through a decomposition theorem. And that's kind of a typical type of statement that you should look for if you need such a property. Namely, what we will do is we will look at an optimal solution and show you can break it in smaller components. And each one of those components is k-thin, is constant thin. So we can actually use that in our solution. But in average, those components are good and there will be one good one. It's very similar to the way actually Zenklusen originally used the relative greedy procedure for symmetry. So let me say maybe first a bit, let's go through those two steps. Let me tell you a little bit about step A. So don't really want to go technically through the whole dynamic program. That's a bit of a, as we all know, dynamic programs are a bit of a pain if you really want to do it in all technical detail. But let me try to explain also what are the main properties we use. And also I tried to say at the beginning already that what's important is we want to start with a highly structured solution because we want to exploit that later. And actually, there's also one point where we exploit that. I would like to highlight that. So the dynamic program works pretty much the way you probably imagine it should work. We will actually fix some vertex to be the root. Let's say this one here, but it could be any vertex. And we will build solutions for subtrees. Let me just pick one subtree. So subtree is just to pick any edge of your spanning tree and look at all the vertices on the non-root side of that edge. That is a subtree. And so now imagine just a little thought experiment. And it's normally the way I often think about when I try to design dynamic programs is I think about, oh, if I want to build solutions for subtrees and then somehow combine them into bigger one. And that's some of the way I want to build a dynamic program. But so what exactly, then the question I ask myself is, what do I need to know from a solution of the subtree that is important for things that happen later outside the subtree? So what is the interface between gray and non-gray? And of course, dynamic programs are precisely the type of tool you want to use if this interface is small, because that's normally the dynamic programming table is an interface. So here we will say there will be a certain, with a partial solution at subtree, we need to know what it already covers in terms of those uplinks, because that's what we win. We need to know how expensive they are, or actually you need to know how these two quantities relate. And then what do we need to know in terms of what kind of links do we need to know in terms of what happens outside? So we need to know all the links that of our partial solution in gray that also actually have an endpoint outside. Let me pick one of them. Let's say, why not this one here? This would be such a link. So it's an uplink, by the way, right? The one endpoint is between the other one and the root, the path to the root. So it should be uplinks. So Did I? Oh, sorry. This one does not have to be this one does not have to be an uplink. This one is just a link that in our solution will be obtained. Maybe I'll just choose one that is not an uplink. Let me choose this one just to be clear. It doesn't need to be an uplink. We may have used that link in our component. Right? And so, and we need to know which links we use that are partially inside, partially outside, because they could be helpful to cover things that are outside, cover uplinks that are outside. But because we only look at constant thin solutions, there are only constantly many links that will cross that vertex here, and therefore only constantly many that are partially inside and outside, so we can just enumerate all of those. That's okay. Another thing we have to check is, we also have to check, there may be an uplink, now there's an uplink, that is partially inside, partially outside. Let's say, so let me just remove the blue one here, and now go to the uplink setting. Now let me go back to one I originally wanted to draw, some link like this one. That's an uplink that we need to know if we want to cover that uplink through our component. We need to know whether the part of the path that's in gray already got covered or not by the solution we fixed inside gray. And this we can do by saving just the flag for that link here, whether this is covered or it isn't covered. So yes, no flag. And this works out for the following reason. So this would be a bad idea if there were a lot of such uplinks for which we need flags. But the thing is that we have precisely one link, one uplink that crosses that will cover that edge here. Because remember, our uplink solution covers every edge precisely once. So there's only a single link with that property, a single uplink that can partially cover stuff in gray and partially outside. So only for that one, we need to know whether we covered the part of its path that's inside gray. And this gives kind of the table entries for Plenary program, and then we can propagate. But again, just want to give you the main ideas. Of course, the technical details are a bit more involved, but it's essentially ingredients. Let me stop it here for the Plenary program and talk about the second part. So now the Plenary program was about being able to find the best component, the one minimizing this ratio or maximizing the bang for the buck. And now comes the statement that says, oh, if you have an uplink solution that's bad, there actually should be a good component, should be a good constant thing component. And this is linked to what we call a decomposition theorem, and that's maybe the main technical result that we have there. And I don't have time to go into the details, but I want to explain to you what it says and why it implies what we want it to imply. So it says the following: if you can fix any constant larger than 0, and let's look at a set of uplinks with disjoint paths. You can think of it as the original uplink solution that then may be a factor of 2 worse than the optimal solution. So it turns out you can partition opt, or actually any solution. Let's just pick opt, because it's the way we will actually invoke the statement later on. So you can partition the links of opt into small components, each one of them being 1 over epsilon thin, such that the following holds. If you look at what you can drop for one of those components, it's here in terms of the weight you can drop, and you sum it up over all components, then you can drop almost the whole weight of U. Almost, I mean, everything except for an epsilon fraction. So let me give an example of how the theorem actually looks like in practice. So here we have an instance. You have an uplink solution, so U, and think of the red edges as opt, as an optimal solution. So what we claim is there always exists. We don't have to find it, by the way, it just exists because we don't know opt in any case. There exists a way to partition opt in thinner components. So let's say this may be one component, C1, and the other one is this one here, the pink one. Let's call it C2. Now let's look what we can drop if I add C2, for example. If I add C2, I can drop just this uplink here. So what I draw here is the drop of the uplinks when adding C2. And if I add C1, I can actually drop this link here. This one is covered too. That one is also covered. That one is not covered. So I can drop just a drop of C1. So it turns out we can partition opt into groups. Each one of them is constant things, into what we call them components, such that there may be something we're not able. So it's actually the way we actually prove the statement. We prove the statement by showing there's a certain number or certain subset of uplinks we're not able to drop in with any of those components, but that set has a very small weight, and that's only an epsilon fraction of the weight, and all the other ones can actually be dropped through at least one of the components. It's just the way we prove it. The statement itself doesn't say that. It only says that, oh, in average, you can remove enough. It doesn't say that there's some things you can, it doesn't say that it's kind of a partition of that what we can, so it shows that we can actually, for each uplink, either it's part of that set that we cannot, that we will not never remove, or it will be, we only account it in one of the components as being able to be removed. And the statement here is a bit more, it's a bit less less strict in the sense that a drop could also contain the same uplink twice for two different components. But in any case, the main message is we can partition opt into smaller components. And if you look at the total drop of those components, that actually is almost all the weight of the uplinks. Somehow, a big optimal solution can be split into smaller ones. And here's another difference compared to prior work that used relative greedy, like Solikovsky. So at Solikovsky, you don't have a 1 minus epsilon fraction, but you can actually get inequality with a 1 here. And so we only get a weaker statement, but those statements are strong enough for what you want to prove. Let me just maybe say a few words about that. So again, the decomposition statement, and what you want to show is if you have expensive uplinks, then there's a good component. So this follows as follows here. So let's look at the total drop of the components that we have through our decomposition theorem. And then by the decomposition theorem, we know that that's at least the 1 minus epsilon fraction of the uplinks. We assume to be in a case where those uplinks are expensive compared to opt. And last but not least, the weight of opt is the same as the weight of the components, because the components are a partition of opt. So we have all those, this chain of inequalities, and it's showing that some of the components here, or what we can drop, is at least as large as the sum of the cost of those components. But then by an averaging argument, there must be at least one component whose drop is larger than what it costs, and this leads to that ratio being smaller than 1. That's the way this can be proven through a decomposition theorem. Now, of course, then to get the actual factor root out of this, you have to be a bit more careful, and it turns out if you then do the computation carefully, you will get, through that reasoning, an approximation factor of just a little bit below 1.7. That's the same factor at Zenklusen, by the way, also for Steiner treatments. Now let me finish by just talking briefly about this new link to non-oblivious local search, relative greedy non-oblivious local search, because this is one weakness, one kind of, I feel it's kind of an obvious weakness of the relative greedy procedure. Namely, the relative greedy procedure only replaces uplinks from the starting solution. So even in later iterations, when you saw that, when we talked about the drop, I always talked about the drop, just write this down once more, drop of U with respect to C. So only we can drop from U if you add a component, but not what we may have added in between, right? We may have added other links in between. We never analyze what we can drop from there because they're not highly structured, and we don't really understand that well how to work with those. And this is what I want to change now, or want to talk about now, but a way to also work with those links. So now we really want to gain also the links that got added in prior iterations, and not just the links that we have from the very start. So assume if a link that got added in an earlier iteration, the link L, then what we want to do is we kind of keep a second picture just for bookkeeping. So on the right-hand side, I have the same graph, and I just replace the link by 2 uplinks. I do the same splitting we did for the 2 approximation we got for our starting solution. I do that here, and I call this the witness set. And so that we borrow this terminology from similar use in Steiner tree. It was an extremely nice paper by Rico, Grandoni, Rothfuss, and Sunny Town, the Steiner tree problem. And they also used witness sets with a similar meaning as we use it here. So we use the same name. So the idea is the following. The idea is that, so this link, I would also like to be able to sometimes realize that actually I can remove that link, also that link L, even though it's not a link we have from the start. So what we do is we just first see we have these 2 parts of it, and we know as soon as you cover both of those parts, you can remove the link, because the link L covers the same parts as these 2 parts, the same tree edges as these 2 links here, these 2 links here. So we will then see how. So we want to kind of reward partial proof. We want to say it's actually good even if you just cover one half of the link, one side of it. Even though this will not help you to actually remove the link right away, it may help you to remove it later on when you cover the other part of those 2 uplinks, the other of the 2 uplinks that we have on the right-hand side. So what we want to do, the idea is to have an auxiliary objective that rewards covering those bookkeeping links, those witness set links over here, even though they do not immediately improve the actual solution. And that's also what is often called non-oblivious objective, because it's not really the actual objective, it's actually a fake objective that rewards something that we want to happen. So how do we do that? So again, we have a solution on the left-hand side. This time it's a general solution. I don't assume anymore that we have an uplink solution. And here I split links into uplinks. So this link here we didn't need to split it because it's already an uplink. The other ones we split into two uplinks. And those are the witness sets. Again, right is just bookkeeping. The left is the actual solution. And what we do is the following. Think of when we have a link here with a certain weight, let's say W of L. I'll just distribute the weight evenly on its witness set. So here I have two witness set links. So I will give to each one of them 1/2 of W of L. And we call this, let's say this L1, and this is maybe L2. Let's call this the W bar weight. So this means that if you cover one of these two, you actually, we do as if you get 1/2 of that weight back, even though of course you don't. Right? This is a bit strange because now you can first cover one of them, you get 1/2 of the weight back, but once you cover one of them, and there's only one left, then actually we will define a new weight for the remaining uplink, and then we will just give it the same weight as the original weight at that moment. And so this means that you can actually now win 3/2 of the original weight in the way we do the accounting. That's why we use a potential that does precisely that. Essentially, it says that for all the links with a witness set of size 1, we give them the same weight. The potential, they contribute their original weight to the potential, and all the ones with a witness set of size 2, they will contribute 3/2 of the original weight. But again, the precise factors are not so important now. The main thing I want to say here is that we have a potential function that just makes you that if you can cover one of the two links in a witness set, it will reward you for that by giving you 1/2 of the weight. So it's partial reward, a reward for partial progress, even though there's no global progress. So what does the procedure do, this local search procedure? It has an arbitrary solution at the beginning. Here we have the bookkeeping on the right. So we split the links into uplinks, and actually also shorten them if necessary to get a minimal solution, because we want to apply the same decomposition theorem we applied before. For example, green got split into two uplinks, and then one of them got shortened. Now we find the components that we will add. Here's again the uplink version, the witness sets of that component. Then we see what this component covers in terms of the witness sets over here. So for example, if you add blue, it will cover both brown ones. It will cover whatever the green one here covered, but not the other green one. So we can remove the brown ones here. We can remove the long green one we had. And then we observe what happened in the original solution. So because we removed both witnesses of the brown link, we can actually remove the brown link here from here to here. There's no brown link anymore. But for example, for the green one, we had two witnesses in the witness set. We only removed one of them, so we have to keep the green link. We rewarded the partial progress, but we did not remove the link. So that's what the procedure, just written down it more explicitly, is sort of an arbitrary tab solution, W tab solution, so weighted tree augmentation solution. And we have this bookkeeping witness sets on the right-hand side. And as long as we can decrease that potential, we will actually find a component such that what we can drop is the drop will lead to larger decrease of the potential than what we add. And then we just keep going ideally until we reach a local optimum, of course, to make sure it stops, the procedure stops in polynomial time. We have to stop it either early or just only make steps that make a significant improvement in a single step. And at the end, we just return what we obtain. Just think about getting a local optimum. So there's no way to improve that potential. So now I just want to finish with a brief analysis. So I already introduced the W bar weight. So it turns out, maybe just want to talk about the box below. It turns out when you remove certain links from your solution, when certain links from the witness sets, so the potential will decrease by at least the W bar weight. And when you add a component, the potential will increase, but by at most 3/2 of the weight, because we said, oh, when we add a link, the potential will actually have a coefficient of 3/2. And what one now can do is so the components we choose will be the ones that maximize that difference between this is the lower bound of what we win at least in the potential and the upper bound of what we of what we lose, so we have to pay at most, and we will maximize that difference. This can again be done through a lambda program, and the decomposition theorem actually will show in this case again that that as long as your current solution is more expensive than 3 or 2 times opt, that we actually can make progress through such a step with a similar chain of inequalities as we had before. Now we can go very briefly through it, but I don't want to spend too much time on it here. We have that the total W bar weight of what we can drop is at least 1 minus epsilon fraction of the W bar weight of all the witness set, all the links in the witness set, because of the decomposition theorem. Then we have that W bar weights are the same as the W weights, because remember when I had a weight on the left-hand side, I just distributed the weight on the right-hand side. So the total weight is the same. And last but not least, we have here, actually not last but not least, is one more equality, but here we have the condition assuming that we don't yet have a good solution. And the last equality is again, just saying the weight of opt is the weight of the parts in the partition. I'll keep it brief, but yeah, because it's similar, but of course it needs a little bit of time to digest. But I would like to go to conclusions and just wrap it up a bit and give you a more global perspective at the very end once more. So we have, so the relative greedy. So what are the take-home messages I would like you to have from this talk? So relative greedy is about getting stronger approximations by improving on highly structured solutions. So it's really important to start with weak solutions, but I mean, what we win by starting with a weak solution is that we can make it highly structured. It's not just good to start a weak solution. Of course, you need to get something for it. That's what we get for it. The key ingredient is really to understand how to break a solution, a good solution, an optimal solution, into smaller parts. What are parts that are smaller but still big enough to actually make improvements locally? And for the weighted treatmentation problem, those parts can be chosen to be thin link sets, constant thin link sets. Then the second message is that, so keep in mind, relative greedy really just improves on the initial structure solution and ignores what you add later. So that seems to be wasteful. And indeed, this is the case for WTAP. We've seen that non-oblivious local search can help. It does witness that, so we reward partial progress, and therefore can also improve on links that got added later on. Here, what's also nice to know, I mean, I just talked about this link with respect to tree augmentation, but actually we can also use that in the Steiner tree setting and replicate the currently best approximation factor of natural logarithm 4 plus epsilon through a local search procedure. So the procedure is different and arguably a bit simpler. I mean, the factor is the same one, essentially for the same reasons, so that is not really a big surprise from that side, but also just shows that indeed it's a more general, it's really a more general maybe idea to go from relative greedy to non-oblivious local search to improve relative greedy algorithms. I mean, more general than just for weighted tree augmentation. Here to summarize the factors we obtained. So the relative greedy was 1 with 7, and then 1 factors epsilon. Again, factors are not so important, but I think techniques are kind of interesting. And there's a lot of open questions that are of interest. There's not that much known about the LPs. There's a lot of open questions there. There's a lot of network design problems that are for which it's still not known how to get below a factor of 2. And so I think it's a very nice area to work on. So that's where I want to close it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and very happy to answer any potential questions.
Thank you very much. I'm glad for everyone else. That was a fantastic talk. So are there any questions? I see anyone raise their hands? Okay, while folks are thinking of probably questions to ask, let me, I was actually, I was intrigued by so this relative greedy algorithm, has it been used for other classes of problems? And I'll give you the way I think about it, because I think of IP solvers all the time. And one of the things that people do is there's something called as a neighborhood search algorithm, but where basically you fix a large part of the solution, and then you sort of work on the small solution. And what the relative greedy sounded like that, because I can't just do these greedy swaps now, right? You really have to work with this component. And is it used for other, like, designing other approximation algorithms for other problems?
Yeah, so actually the relative greedy has been used also prior to our work by Cohen and Newton. There's a work that used relative greedy for bounded diameter trees. It was able to beat the factor 2. So this bounded diameter trees allow you to don't look at constant sized components again, and then you can do it with you can do a relative greedy with those. with those components, also getting this factor of slightly below 1.7, the same one as the cost got. There are a few more, actually, a few more cases where it really got used, but not that many. So far. Yeah, at least not that I know of, but I may also have missed some.
And I have maybe one more question, but I'll wait for if someone wants to quickly. Is there any other questions? Okay, maybe I'll ask one more question. So yeah, if you look at and maybe you you probably already mentioned this in your sort of future research, but so is there any relationship between these thin components, identifying these thin components, and like the fraction structure of the LP, or they're completely unrelated?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, one could also try, but one could. I mean, then now talk a bit about links to LPs. It's very, very interesting questions, by the way.
Okay.
Of course, one could also try to find somewhat better LPs somehow, right? And
Okay.
the route structure ones. And here, one could also try to use constraints based on thin components, but maybe at some point we're a bit cheating in a sense that we're too much looking into the. I mean, so people wonder whether there's a natural LP for which you can easily show a factor, the integrality gap below 2. And of course, one can now kind of reverse engineer things and try to go from the procedure to an LP.
Right.
This may be interesting though, but
like an extended formulation that looks at these thin components, something like this. Yeah, I see.
Exactly. This probably is a way to do something like that. Maybe also with but also one could try is use some equivalence between separation and optimization with those thin components. But I really wonder, I think that your question is another interesting core, namely, is there maybe a natural LP that somehow incorporates that even implicitly such constraints? And I don't know the answer. I think it's a very good question. Yeah.
Okay, I guess in the interest of time as well, I think because the session is almost out, so I think I'll call a close to this session. Am I supposed to do something here? I don't know. I think folks are taking off.
Yes, no problem. You just have to quit. And thank you, Rico, for.
Well, thank you, Rico. It was a fantastic talk.
Really for the fantastic talk.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Many thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, see you.
Bye.
Bye.